A game of Victoria 3 starts a little something like this, quizzing over which nation to play. What kind of government do I have? Am I a colony? Am I wealthy? Do I have an army? Can I fight my neighbours? Maybe there's somebody nearby who's a bit weaker than me and I could grab them at the start. But there are a lot of things that you learn as you go through Victoria 3 and realise, dang, I probably should have played that a little bit differently. And so in this video, I'm going to reflect on what I wish I knew about Victoria 3 before I started playing. With time cards below, let's jump in. As a grand strategy game that's an economic simulator at its core, you will therefore probably lean toward tabs like budget and markets fairly often. The markets tab is fundamentally the one that you should draw to first though, and that's why it ranks so close to the start of this video. Here you'll get a look at all of the different goods, sell orders and buy orders. Here of course you'll want to find a relative equilibrium, and if you don't have it, it'll be represented here. Here you can see we're out of balance by 832 orders of grain, and that is causing the price in the market to be 26% above the base price. That's a bad thing. People are paying too much for their grain. We need to try and fix that, and that's what one of the fundamental things in Victoria 3 is all about. So if we click into it, we'll get a look at how we can do that. And there are essentially two ways. To keep it relatively simple but also relatively quick, the first way is by going to the Applications tab, having a look at the different buildings that produce the good, right? These rye farms produce grain. For example, millet farms produce 30 grain as well. Some farms may produce a mixture of goods. That doesn't really matter to us here as much. We just want to make sure that we can figure out ways to increase our supply and therefore lower the price, bring it back down to market equilibrium. The other way we could do it is by creating a trade route down the bottom here. We can then select a trading partner. You can see that some trades are better than others, and man alive, some nations produce a lot more of certain goods than others. But either way, you can filter by productivity, try and find a trade route that's productive, and pull more goods immediately into your economy that way. Whether you've just been thrown into a game or you're managing a thriving or maybe struggling economy, let's quickly talk about some budgeting basics so that we're all on the same page. There have been some changes to Victoria 3 after all, and it was a complicated beast to begin with. You may be jumping in and looking at a negative balance book. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but fundamentally, let's quickly figure out some ways that we can quickly adjust it. Obviously, we could look to our taxation, and again, we'll talk on that in a bit, but in the short term, you could look to raise your taxes up to high. This, as you can see, would actually quickly fill most of our deficits. The other way to do it would be to actually enact some specific consumption taxes. Generally speaking, you want to try and target these towards luxury goods or goods that a lot of people aren't consuming. Maybe luxury clothes might be a good example if the wealthy are already thriving. However, sometimes it can be a good idea temporarily to drive some money into the economy and just tax grain or services. But do take care with taxing these fundamental goods. And actually, I would really strongly encourage you to stick around for the next tip, where we'll dive in a little bit deeper, and I'll teach you something that maybe doesn't intuitively come to a lot of players. But the final thing that we need to talk about here is on wages. These have changed a lot in patch updates over the course of Victoria 3's relatively young life, but at the moment it's a very good idea to drive some benefits out of this, particularly the plus 10% authority out of high government wages, and also crucially some military buffs down here. We'll talk a little bit more about the military later in the video, but it's important to note also that the negative wage growth categories, the very low and the low, do now provide some fairly nasty modifiers. You wouldn't want to be fighting with reduced training rate, maybe your power projection being lower isn't ideal, and also the minus 20% prestige, not quite as impactful, but generally speaking, try and keep this in the middle or drive it up high, because it is after all just putting more money into the pockets of your people. Back on the market tab, we can also filter by market price. This will give us a good look exactly into which goods are surging well above their base price. Here, of course, we want to really pay close attention to the ones that we're going to be using the most. So, do I need to focus on luxury furniture at the moment with very few sell orders and likely only appealing to a small, rich market? Probably not. We probably need to focus on our tools, which are also wildly overpriced in the market. Here Here again, of course, I'd take the same approach as before. Maybe I want to build more tooling workshops. This would also drive demand for the other goods that it's consuming, by the way, like wood and iron. Or, of course, we could look to import some, providing that we have the capacity to do so. We may need to build more convoys, for example, if we want to trade in more goods. There are more arms to managing the economy, and we'll talk about them a little bit later in the video, but the final one that I want to mention as a fundamental basic thing that you should know about Victoria 3 is actually in the populations tab, and this I think will find its way further and further into the mainstream of the game as it continues to receive updates, at least here's hoping. But if we click into a region as a test, let's take the Spanish Central region here, and then go to its population tab. You can see we have 1.26 million Spaniards living here, or 1.26 million people. Anyway, we get a breakdown of their demographics, and we can see that actually majority of them are peasants. Clicking into the peasants here, and we can get a good look at what exactly they're producing, what they need. Here we can really tailor in on the specific needs of our people, and you can see that actually over 1/3 of what our peasants are spending on is grain. So if we can bring the price of this down, we'll give them more money to spend on other goods and drive economic growth in the region. As we look over the Spanish beautiful, beautiful nation, and we see some territories really struggling and others doing all right, one thing that I want to teach you, and a callback to an earlier part in the video, is that debt actually isn't always that bad. Fundamentally, debt isn't that bad because taxing people's purchasing power limits the growth of your economy. So, while yes, in the short term we could look to drive our taxes up to a very high tax rate, when we hover over it and see the effects, not only will it make it a little bit more difficult in terms of our, say, national economy, keeping things stable, look at that rise in radicalism, for example, but it also really takes money out of the back of people's pockets. And if we remember thinking back to our populations and their different needs, these people are struggling as it is, already paying too much for goods that they require. It might not be a good idea to be taking more money away from them. As we move through the game, we could potentially look to our politics and laws system to reform our taxes and maybe generate more money that way. But for the time being, it's important to note that debt isn't always that bad, particularly if we're using it to drive construction and buildings, to build more opportunities in our economy. Maybe, and ideally also, looking to exploit some wonderful resources. If there's a good like gold, for example, that we're not actively pursuing mining and expanding on as much as we can, or maybe we're a wonderful producer of tobacco, or the world demands coffee, there is a massive market out here, a reminder, a massive global market, and we can at any time start to export our export production out to the world. So why not focus on what we do best, take on some debt in the short term and use it to drive growth? That should be your goal. So don't be afraid if your number is a little bit red, especially if that bar underneath is full and you've got plenty of cash in the reserves. The final thing that I'd like to note is that Victoria 3 isn't really a military game, and if you're a regular player or a fan of the channel, then you'll already know that. But there are some important strategies and tips that we can talk about around that are really actually quite fundamental to the game, despite it not being a massive or central part. It's an economic simulator, and the military is one arm to achieve that goal. The navy may be even less important, although protecting your trade routes shouldn't be undervalued. However, in this video, what I'd like to focus on is actually the element of fighting. It can be tempting, I think, to jump into a game like Victoria 3, as we talked about at the start. Maybe you've chosen a nation that's more powerful than someone next door, and you could easily, say, start to damage their relations, maybe expel their diplomats, I don't know, make some sort of conquer state play, maybe you want to make them a dominion. Generally, it would be a conquer state play. Here, a tip inside of a tip. One thing that I really wish I knew was that I really have to add extra war goals, and sometimes, especially when the game first came out, the AI could just force me to capitulate and cede one to them. But now it's arguably even more important to make sure that if I want to take more than just one little tiny state, i.e. a region of this nation state, then I'm going to actually need to select that and make that one of my war goals. The other fundamental part here as well is to try and look for some friends. The Sway Countries tab can literally turn a completely losable fight that you should just kiss your sweet backside goodbye around. And it's simply and easily achievable by pulling in a great power. Now, at the moment, I have no sway over anybody. There's no chance that they would really accept, but it can be actually quite easy to generate some sway with these people. Fundamentally, of course, at the start of the game, you'll want to look to some great powers nearby and start improving relations with them. Build up some relations, get some trade going. They'll love you, you'll love them. Maybe you can move towards some more advanced diplomacy. But either way, once you've pulled in those other arms of Victoria 3, your great power allies, maybe some market manipulation and trade, and hopefully checked your overview, maybe added the extra territories that you want. Of course, a reminder again that while we're doing the military, we're still looking to achieve our economic gains. So have a look at the territories. Have a look in for the individual ones that you want. Maybe certain territories have resources that you could be after, or buildings already constructed. Once you've factored all of those things in, you'll then be able to move in and fight. Finally, of course, make sure you activate your conscripts. This is something that could easily be forgotten. You may not want to pull your population away from your core economic centers though, but you can probably pull them away from the sides. But don't forget that these populations, these conscripts in particular, are the people working in your factories and potentially on your farms. So take care. A final reminder that the military isn't the only goal here. In fact, it's more of a means, one way to achieve the goal of economic domination in Victoria 3. Thank you very much for joining me today in this video. If you'd like to know more, maybe some more advanced tips and tricks, or a little bit more information about some of the things that I've discussed, I've got plenty more videos on the channel where this one came from. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.